What are they booing about? I don't know. Well, welcome to the Mindful Cranks, where using your mind is not necessarily a bad thing, and where being cranky can actually be mindful. Let's crank it up. All right, today we're back on the air. The Mindful Cranks, we've been off for a few months for various reasons and holidays and all that. But
Happy New Year.
Yeah, Happy New Year. And my comrade in Brooklyn is with us today. So we're really happy to have Glenn Wallis on today's episode. We've both been a fan of his work, and we've been interacting with him off and on several other projects. And he has a new book out called A Critique of Western Buddhism, which we will try to get into a little bit later. So welcome, Glenn.
Thank you very much.
Yes, and in a standard podcast fare, we'd like to open it up, and I'm curious personally of where you grew up. What kind of let's start from the ground zero there. Your story of growing up and how you eventually moved into being interested in Buddhism to the point where you got your Ph.D. in Harvard, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll try to say something about that in relation to this actual project, just to frame it in a certain way that's relevant. Well, to go back to the beginning, I was born in Oklahoma.
Really?
Which is actually not insignificant, because my father was a student there, and he grew up on a farm there, and he was, and it's, our parents have a lot to do with our autobiography, beginning with our parents, have a lot to do with why we end up doing what we do, thinking what we think, and so forth. And my father came out of this he grew up around the same area as Woody Guthrie, to give you an example, and he came out of that populist, anti-status, pro-union, progressive background. So I was born there, but we moved to Kansas City when I was a baby. So I grew up in Kansas City till I was 10, Kansas City, Missouri. And then I came to South Jersey, Philadelphia area. I've been living in the Philadelphia area since I was 11 years old. To the city when I was 15. I've been here ever since. My mother comes from immigrant background, Sicilian, grew up in Brooklyn, New York, which also relevant to the project. Yeah. Oh, yeah, where David is now.
Yeah.
Because she came from this, immigrant family, Italian family, always kind of on the outside. Mm-hmm. They were, looked down on, and that formed her own politics very much, which also turned out to be, I would say, progressive, maybe socialist if you go a little farther left. My father actually flirted with communism when he was a young man, but ended up even being like a delegate to the Progressive Party. So when I was in high school, if I can skip ahead that far, I would say, first of all, I had an upbringing. My parents were both therapists. My mother was a social worker, went into therapy work. My father was a psychologist. So I was around a certain kind of discourse. My mother had a practice at home. I was paying close attention to what was going on with that. I'm sure that has a lot to do with my interests here. My parents sent me to an anarchist high school when I was, 15 years old, 16 years old.
Oh, that explains it then.
That explains a lot.
In Philadelphia?
It was actually in South Jersey in a town called Morristown. I just took the speed line over, and I was the 15th student of what became, all of 21 students before the place closed down. It had to close down a year and a half later for various reasons. I mean, for one reason being that it was an anarchist school. I ended up dropping out of high school, but I learned a lot. I think so much of what happened in that year and a half in that school was so deeply formative for me. First of all, I started studying Buddhism in that high school. I started reading the Dhammapada. A man named Bruce. My main interest, the first thing they did when I went to that school is they said, what do you want to learn about? And, this was like 1975 or something, and all things Eastern were in the air, right?
Yep.
Meditation, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi and all that. And I said, I'd like to learn about Eastern philosophy, I think is how I put it. And they got this guy named Bruce. And this is also significant because Bruce had been training to be an IBM executive. He was like in their junior managers training program, but he learned that IBM had been involved in collecting data on the ground in Vietnam, and that turned him off. So he abandoned all that, but he was conflicted about all that. And we read the Dhammapada, and I look back now, I really didn't think about it at the time, but our reading of the Dhammapada was infused with this social criticism that Bruce brought to the text. So, the very first stanza in the Dhammapada about, the phenomena being, follow the mind and so forth. He would not only say, okay, how might that be useful and interesting and give rise to some sort of personal, spiritual, whatever cultivation. And then it'd also be and how might that be problematic for, sustaining the material forms that exist. A lot of this was over my head back then. I mean, almost all of it was, but it occurred to me years later how profound and significant that was to my life, that initial reception of Buddhism coming along with the social criticism. So I dropped out of high school and, then I got into punk rock, which is also relevant, I imagine.
Yeah, we wanted to ask you about that.
Well, that was all very much infused by kind of anarchist, anti-authoritarianism, do-it-yourself, collectivism. I was very, very formed by that, and I was very serious to me, and I worked very hard at it for many years with my bandmates, who I actually dedicated this book to. It has a subtitle, Ruins of the Buddhist Real, and our band was called Ruin.
Yeah.
That's been kind of a motif throughout my life. And
I'm going to have to download that.
What's that?
I'm going to have to download that, some of your music.
It's on Spotify. I wouldn't recommend it, but
okay.
We were serious, and we had an impact on the Philadelphia area, a little bit more maybe San Francisco, where we spent a lot of time. And but in any case, and I also, again, we're formed as individuals, right? And I was very much formed by participation in the punk scene, and which is very politicized, and tried to open your eyes to material structures around you and so forth. So eventually I did go to college, at Temple University in Philadelphia, I studied philosophy. Then I eventually went to Germany, and I studied Sanskrit and Tibetan and Pali, and in the old-fashioned German philological tradition, which is very, very rigorous, very hard. I mean, I didn't have the background. All my classmates came from these kind of elite German schools. Yeah. So it was really great in forming, my discipline as a thinker, and that was very formative for me as well. I was there for 5 years. And I didn't want to spend my whole life in Germany. I felt I didn't have a good chance of getting to the academic, an academic position just because of the way things are set up there. So I thought I better come back to America to finish my work. And I came back, and really the only logical place to go to continue the kind of work I was doing in Germany was Harvard, because that was the only school that was still offered this option of a kind of philological approach to Buddhist studies or religious studies. So I went to Harvard, also very formative in many ways. And then I got a job. I got jobs in academia. I eventually went to University of Georgia, where I got tenure. For various reasons, I don't know if you know, a lot of my work now has to do with higher education, a critique of higher education. I have an online journal called Incite Items.
No, I didn't know about that.
Yes, it's called Incite Items. on educational iconoclasm or something like that. I forget what the tag is, but yeah, right. Yeah, you have a look. That's my interest now, is kind of a critique of higher education and what might be done with that. So I left. I gave up tenure, and I left the University of Georgia for long, complicated reasons having to do with not wanting to participate in a certain, sort of capital, what I'll just say, like, I talk about Althusser in the book. So what Althusser would call an ideological state apparatus. I didn't want to be a manager in one of those. So I left and I got a job in the Buddhist-oriented institute in the Philadelphia area, which brought me back to Philadelphia. I left in 85 to go to Germany, 87 to go to Germany. And I worked in this place for 10 years. This is called the Won Institute. The program was called Applied Meditation Studies. I loved it. It was great. I had great, incredible, interesting students from all kinds of fields, from like Oxford-educated neuroscientists to poets and social workers and psychologists and teachers, and they were critically minded, people who want to do something with contemplative practice, but not in the ways that you've been critiquing about, that we see happening now with mindfulness and so forth. But we went a little too far in that, and this is another theme that runs through all my stuff is you keep thinking and it keeps causing trouble. And the trouble this caused was that I think it was taking me out of a practice or contemplative practice as a kind of sitting down Zen-oriented type of thing into more and more into the social and the political sphere. So this is kind of guess where that story ends is they didn't renew my contract, so I'm out of that job, and now then I founded this Incite Seminars. I don't know if you've seen anything about that.
I've heard about it, yeah.
That's INCITE. It's a play on Incite, the other Insight.
Yeah.
But the idea is you bring together something like practices that create personal awareness, but also create something like collective agency or collective change. And we offer seminars of all kinds of topics, usually kind of left related, also philosophically related, but we're always trying to bring in the social. I'm directing that now. I'm trying to build that up now, and I adjunct usually 1 or 2 or 3 courses at Penn State Abington, which is nearby. But I definitely feel like I'm out of academia. If anything, I'm kind of one of these para-academics. We hear more and more talk about that, and I feel liberated and happy about that. So I guess that kind of brings us up to today.
That's quite an evolution.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you share a lot in common with us. I grew up in a blue-collar family in the south side of Chicago. And David, obviously, is... Go ahead, David.
Well, my mother was a therapist, too.
Oh.
And she was also a progressive.
Oh, maybe they knew each other.
Oh, it could be, yeah.
Are you from Brooklyn?
No. I grew up in Westchester, suburb.
Okay, yes, New York. Yeah. There's Westchester, Pennsylvania, too.
That's right. Yeah, yes. It's 2 words, yes. But that was one question I was interested in also, was that your parents were in the mental health profession, but you didn't necessarily feel like you went in that direction. Or they had to go in that direction.
I was very drawn to it and very interested in it. I always had jobs when I was an undergrad at Temple, like work study jobs where I'd work with this place that my father ran. It was called Horizon House. Then it became the director of a mental hospital. I always had work in those areas. I worked with mental health patients, and I really enjoyed it. I found the larger structure of mental health and psychology very problematic, and an aversion to it. And it's related to this work here. There's something about these larger structures that are subjugating in ways that are disturbing to me. So I didn't feel like I had a path into it. My father was skeptical too. He understood. I mean, he had this position. He didn't go as far as this anti-psychiatry of a guy like Thomas. Was it Thomas Szasz?
Thomas Szasz, yeah.
But he was very critical of. He would speak in ways that we need to keep these people crazy, or we can't get our budget next year, and things along those lines.
I know exactly what you're talking about. I put myself through undergraduate college working at residential psych hospitals, so I know exactly what you're talking about.
And was that, for me, this was in the 80s where, there's the last days of these kind of snake pit kind of places. I mean,
right. Warehouses.
Yeah, I was working in the 80s as well.
You were working where?
I was working in psych hospitals in the 80s too.
Oh, yeah. So you saw that. I mean, maybe that also informs a bit your, I don't know what you want to call it, or allergy to certain things going on in mindfulness and so forth. I mean, our autobiographies play a role, don't they?
Yeah, they do very much.
Yeah, definitely. So, I think we both came across your work quite a while back. You were one of the, I would say, one of the first, or even one of the early critics of the mindfulness movement, going way back before the McMindfulness critique.
Yeah, I don't know about the chronology of it. I discovered you guys' work very early, so I remember. I mean, I was critical of, I was teaching in a Zen tradition, and I had a Zendo in Philadelphia, believe it or not, and I felt very, very uncomfortable in teaching in that capacity for a lot of the reasons that eventually I started seeing happening in the mindfulness industry as well. And a lot of it had to do with just a certain kind of, subjugation of the person and kind of conceptual, like sort of bullying of the person about what they should value or what's good or bad and all this.
Yeah, a lot of authoritarianism. Yes, absolutely. And I don't like, it's turned out that I really dislike authoritarian forms of thought and action. But yeah, so early on, mindfulness was starting to become more and more popular. And I think it might have had to do something with the fact that I was at the Won Institute, because we were trying to, there's no other way to say it other than sell, this program to people. And it was a meditation program, and we kept bumping into all around us. It was like, well, what about mindfulness? I don't want to do meditation because that's religious. I want to do mindfulness. So I had to contend with it. And everyone I met, was all about mindfulness, and all the people around here in the big institutions, Jefferson Hospital, University of Pennsylvania, and so forth, they have these big mindfulness training programs that are very successful. They get 400 people for a training, and we're lucky to get 4 for a new, for a year.
All right.
So I had to contend with it. So I just started reading it and paying it, seeing what it was about, and I think the critique just came out of that.
Mm-hmm.
I think the Penn Center for Mindfulness is a big.
Yeah. Is that what it's called? I'm not sure what it's called.
Something like that. Yeah.
It's big and it's successful, and they, who knows, thousands and thousands of people have gone through there, and it became a force, to reckon with, I guess is how you put it.
Yeah. We read. I remember reading Elixir of Mindfulness.
Yeah. That was my first real, here it is. I was just reading in like Mindful Magazine or whatever it's called, mindful.org.
Mindful Magazine, yeah.
Mindfulness does everything you can imagine. Everything. It can help you with sex and do your taxes. Yes.
Dog walking. Let's not forget that.
Yeah, dog walking. And I'm not sure if that's for the dog or the walker. I couldn't figure out, who's the mindful one here? Mindful dog training. Are you teaching your dog to be mindful? So I just got kind of, I was like, this is crazy. They're trying to what I was just occurred to me, and what I was realizing was something that we can talk about later that comes up big in this book is mindfulness is claiming a sufficiency for itself.
Right.
It's this cure. It's this curative something that will just do all this incredible work. And so, yeah, that post, Elixir of Mindfulness, was my first attempt to to kind of formulate my thinking, but / disgust.
Which is another theme of your book, disgust.
It is.
I also remember in that blog you wrote about, you characterize mindfulness with the Levi Strauss term, a floating signifier.
Yes. Yes. That is what it was. How I was seeing it operating was that you can just, again, it goes back to this idea of sufficiency, that you can, what does it mean? Who knows what it means? But it can be made to mean all kinds of different things. You can just drop it into all kinds of different discourses about health or whatever it is, and it can be productive in a certain way. And that eventually I would get some language for what I was seeing. Back then I just used the Levi-Strauss. Is that Levi-Strauss?
Yeah.
Later on I picked up more in Laura Weldon kind of language, and he would call that a floating signifier, something like, a result of sufficiency within a semantic system or something like that. But it's good to get language to help articulate what it is we're seeing. Yeah.
So for a while, you were the blogs were sort of central for what you were doing for a while. I mean, those got a lot of attention.
Yeah, and to our listeners, I recommend you look at the blogs are very aesthetic. You have a beautiful picture for each one of them.
I keep changing the pictures. I don't know when's the last time you looked, but I recently just kind of I want to change it. It's like redecorating the living room or something, But I do always the aesthetics are important to me, so I appreciate that. I think aesthetics are generally very important, and they also express something of the content of a thing. The aesthetics. Yes. The blog turned out to be really important to work out a lot of the ideas that would become this non-Buddhism. And in the beginning, I have posts in there that have 258 or 260 comments. And some of those comments were like long essays in and of themselves. There's a lot to say about that blog. It's complex, the politics on it and the kind of ideas it wrote. But as you know, I cooled everything down, kind of, let everything go down. I even stopped taking comments. And then when I kind of started bringing it up again, we have not been getting the number of contents that we were before. And that's fine. It's not, the point of it is not to have comments. I mean, the point is just to write text and think through things and make them available.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I have a quote from one of the earlier ones, too, on empathic dogma.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can read my own writing here. What do supposedly, quote, skillful values, such as non-judgmentalism, non-reactivity, equanimity, and so on, look like when extrapolated out to the political sphere?
Yeah.
Again, that's one of our themes. So we're constantly trying to, as you mentioned earlier, we're trying to contextualize. We're trying to contextualize these
right.
so-called skills. And
yes.
Instead of just letting them be floating vague generalities.
Right, and it is a really interesting project for me to do this, and it's shown up on different essays or posts on the blog. It's just become part of my thinking. Is okay, this idea, it sounds interesting, it sounds viable, it sounds valuable, but what happens when we extrapolate it out? When we extend it out beyond some sort of private practice for the inner sphere of my consciousness. Yes. Because the claims made, again, this goes to the idea of sufficiency. The claims made about these things are that they're unitary, they're part of a larger system of thought that hangs together and is very expansive and far-reaching, that has ramifications for all aspects of life. They're not about just this limited inner sphere. So it's fair to ask, what is the value of this thing when extrapolated out beyond this limited sphere? Because it's being claimed as a kind of universal, far-reaching value, non-judgmentalism. Right? What does it mean to be non-judgmental? I don't even know if I could have a conversation if I really embodied non-judgmentalism. I mean,
Yeah.
What is it? What does it have to be non-judgmental towards Donald Trump, for God's sake? I mean, yeah. So that I'm interested in that practice of extrapolation.
Yes, we are too.
Yeah. Yes. Well, that's where your critique. I mean, that's where these structures like mindfulness get into trouble. Is and that's a theme in this book, is that they try to claim something way beyond what they really have any business in claiming. They claim to be kind of unitary system of thought that is sufficient in many, many ways for the well-being of a human being. So when you start performing a critique on an evaluation, they get into trouble pretty quickly.
Yeah, we know about that. I'm just sort of chomping at the bit to get into that, to get into your book a bit.
Sure.
A critique of Western Buddhism. It's a challenging book, a demanding book, but I think your writing is fierce and fearless and uninhibited. It's there's a certain quality that's coming through that's like a lion's roar to me. No, really. I mean, I really respect it.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, and
thank you.
So I'd like to dive into it because I think we're already starting to talk about some of the themes that you bring up, actually, and this whole essentialist, universalist discourse, it's all mixed up with perennialism, the whole mindfulness thing. But I think what we share in common is that mindfulness is woefully unaware of its ideological commitments.
Yeah.
And it's almost like it has almost like an autoimmune system that wants to defend itself from taking a look at its ideological commitments.
Yes.
And so I think what your book uses the language, and I was going to ask you about this, of the real. Does that come from Lacan, or is that something that's where does yeah.
Well, just to your first point there, I think that's so true, and it's so significant. Is does this system of thought perform a self-critique, like a genuine good faith self-critique? And the systems of thought where we could say yes, they do. Then I think we can have there's a line drawn between those that say we say yes, we do perform such a critique, self-critique, and those who say, okay, maybe there are three lines here. There are some that say no, we don't, because we're a faith or whatever it is. We don't need to perform that. We're not claiming to be some sort of empiricism or phenomenology or science. And there are those, I would say, like mindfulness, that actually think they do perform such a self-critique. They think they are self-critique through and through.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's what the rhetoric says. Mindfulness is nothing if not a perpetually performed critique of self-experience and so forth. Right. So I think that's a big issue that we should make people should become more aware of, like that question. Where's the actual self-critique? I don't know. This is a little bit of an aside, but it's relevant. I don't know if you saw the conversation between Angela Davis and John Kabat-Zinn.
Oh yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Edwin Nung. Edwin Nung and I wrote an article about white privilege in the mindfulness movement.
I don't want to talk about that now, but I found it very painful to watch.
He's embarrassed.
Yes, and one of the big reasons is precisely this issue you're raising here about this refusal or inability, whatever it is, to perform a serious good faith self-criticism. The second question was about the real.
Yeah.
I use the concept of a real because it's an extremely important element of human thought. It shows up again and again in different systems of thought, not always with that language of the real, but we can find concepts that correlate very nicely to concepts of the real. It goes back, Plotinus talked about the one. So the real, in the way I'm using it, eventually in the Laruellan sense, it's synonymous with the one, which is another ancient concept, and that is deemed essential to thinking the nature of reality. That we have, like with Plotinus, he says, how we have this many, we have this pluralism, this infinite number of forms. What is their relation? How do they form a web of reality? And eventually, I'm doing them a very big disservice here, but he eventually comes on this idea there must be a one. Like, let's say we have a football team, to use a crass example. The Eagles are back in the playoffs, so.
Which is a miracle. A bit of a miracle, but.
Yeah. We have all these men running around on the field, right, doing all these weird things, but yet that's not the truth of the situation. The truth of the situation is that there's a one occurring. There's a team. There's a game, and it's structured in a certain way. So what is this one? It doesn't show up anywhere. We only have the multitude or the plurality, but we can't think without thinking a notion of the one. We have music playing, we have all these different instruments, but they're forming, there's an implicit one and all that. So it's an idea that shows up very, very early. And it's an idea that I think Buddhism is all about. Really. Yeah. It's about the real. So in the book, I get a lot of usage out of the psychoanalytic idea of the real, whether it's Freud's idea of a piece of unconquerable nature in the human. Mm-hmm. There's just something there that disrupts and is productive in ways that we can't really even understand or grasp, but like an object, a large object in space, or dark matter or whatever, a black hole, we can see the production around it, or the Lacanian idea, that there's just, disavowed features of reality that we never allow ourselves to gaze at.
It's excluded from symbolic representation.
Right.
Yeah.
So he even talks about, literary people will talk about that there's always something within the system that if we can really get at it and let it speak, we discover that it's saying something about the impossibility of this very thing to be totalized, even though it's trying to be totalized.
Right.
Those are all really interesting ideas that, Stephen King's movies and books are all about some real, something hidden or dark or secretive that we can't quite see or put our finger on or articulate, and yet it's productive of life.
So there's I think you're saying though that Western Buddhism is actually distrustful of the real in some ways.
Right. So and before I do that, need to.
That's a jump.
In the book, before I do that, I need to. That is a definite theme. That's the big theme probably of the book, is that Buddhism is a system of thought that articulates in really incredible ways, in really, really rich language and metaphors and art and practice. It articulates the existence of a real.
Right.
Emptiness, pain, whatever, however you want to articulate it. And then it performs something routinely such that I started saying there's no point in arguing about Buddhism or with Buddhists. Rather, the point is to recognize its actual identity, like what it is as a form of thought. Like, imagine someone reading The Onion thinking it's like legitimate criticism. We have to understand the identity of this thing to even say anything about it or to criticize it. What I started understanding is that the identity of Buddhism, it hinges precisely on this refusal, or say this resistance to the very real that it articulates. And I try to use examples with David Loy and Alan B. Wallis and Alan Wallis and Garfield and Suzuki and other teachers, the Dalai Lama even, to try to show how this is something that recurs time and time again. The Buddhist teacher will articulate some sort of deep human structure. Like Garfield talks about, he says, when the Buddha talks about pain, it's like when Heidegger talks about an existential, something that is woven into the very fabric of existence.
Yeah,
it's not like pain is not like a concrete block on the road.
It's not a sensation. It's some fundamental structure of existence. Yeah.
Yes. It's like the concrete in the road. It's woven into but then Garfield and all the others, they make this move that I say is constitutive of the very identity of Buddhism. I call it a parapraxis. That's a psychoanalytic term, a kind of a conceptual misturning. They turn it away from that real into, so often it's opposite. So like the real of pain or the real of emptiness or the real of no self becomes this wonderful, full thing to be celebrated and to give life joy and meaning. And I'm saying it's this very resistance to the real that actually forms Buddhism's identity. Now, I just want to add real quickly in case I don't have time to get to it later or I forget it, and that is that Laura Well wouldn't like these psychoanalytic notions of the real. He would say they're too philosophical. I tried to write a critique here that I felt was I'm not sure what the right word is, but that I try to write a really far-reaching critique that would be very, very difficult to refute.
Yeah, I think you've done that.
and to do that, I had to, the psychoanalytic notion of the real, or the linguistic notion of the real, of kind of a cipher at the heart of things, or language. We're still too philosophical. And Laurel provided a notion of the real that avoids the problems that the philosophical notion of the real presented. Just to put it in really succinctly, what he does is he the way he puts it is he axiomatizes the real. Mm-hmm. He says nothing about it. And this is very important because the arrow is no longer going, the arrow of thought, and I use this little graphic in the book, is no longer going into the real or towards the real. In other words, if Buddhism would just say, no self is a human real, pain is a human real, and operate out of those reals, it would be a whole different kind of form of thought and practice. But what it does is, it makes excursions into this real and tries to articulate what it is. And in doing that, it mistakes the real for its own reflection of itself.
Yeah, and instead of letting the real speak for itself.
Yes, right.
So then they use language. They're conceptualizing it.
They're using language. What was the other part?
Well, conceptualizing it, trying to capture
right.
it.
Yes, and we could say there's nothing wrong with that. That's a great, beautiful human practice to do that, but they confuse their language and their concepts for the thing itself.
Do they equate them?
Yes, there's an equation, and that's exactly why Laura. So think of the equal sign, right? Like it shows passage from one to the other, or an equality or parallelism between the other graphically. So what Laura does, he draws a bar, like what do you call, like think of that. That's a backslash, right? It's barred. The real.
You mean across the equation sign?
Or just
not equal.
Between the equation and the real itself, there's this line that cannot be breached by human thought. The real is productive of even the very forms that give rise to human thought. Mm-hmm. We have to be very, very careful. It's not a thing in Laurel. It's not some sort of mystical realm of experience or being. It's an element of thought that allows us to see when our thinking is moving from the immanence, which the form of thought says it's operating within, like science, towards a kind of transcendence.
Right.
That's how the real functions.
I wonder if we could back up a bit because there's so many rich themes in the book and they're all kind of interconnected. So I wouldn't mind, if you don't mind, at least maybe because I'm handicapped, that can we chronologically kind of like maybe go through some of the chapters?
Sure.
And because I think it really does build. So in chapter 1, which is the snares of wisdom, what I see in that chapter is, a lot of the mindfulness critique going on. The whole collusion that as you put it, the complex collusion, right, with the well-being discourse, positive psychology, happiness, mindfulness, resilience, that whole ball of wax. And but as you're doing that, you're kind of harping on the ideological complicity of Western Buddhism and mindfulness, for that matter, in terms of kind of being complicit with producing the neoliberal subject.
Yes.
And I have a lot of interest in that. So as you're doing that, one question that comes to mind, I don't know if you asked this question, but how did we go from what was a highly renunciatory, anti-materialist, anti-establishment sort of, I'm talking like even before the hippies, but you can take the hippies too, to becoming so easily co-opted as a capitalist spirituality?
I mean, that's a great question. You guys really are the ones who should be answering that.
Yeah.
You can better answer that question than I can, but my own gut feeling, let's always remember that the material, Buddhism in some sense is just an inert cultural material. It's books and words and books and text and art and practices. We have to always remember and never forget that it's people are doing things with this material.
Right.
So the question becomes almost a kind of sociological question. Mm-hmm. I know, maybe Will Davies could better answer. Is that why somehow we'd have to do a study genealogical kind of historical study to figure out how the Google people or the managers. This would be kind of more of a historical studies. How did they learned about these ideas? I know when I was at the Won Institute, I had business people coming through asking me about mindfulness, and something was out there apparently where they were getting these ideas that this is something that can serve their bottom line and make their workforce more docile. How that happened, I don't know exactly, but that's my point here, I guess, is that this is what leads to the final notion of a Buddho fiction, is that this is really just raw material that we can do all kinds of things with, interesting or destructive, or anywhere in between. I don't really know the answer to how this happened. I think it's more of a kind of an historical question, don't you think? Or?
Yeah, there's some really good work that's been coming out lately on that sociological. We're going to have Kasunikis, I think is how you say your last name, and she has a book called The Mindful Elite. Her Ph.D. dissertation was
sociology. That sounds really interesting. I'm glad to see this kind of work happening. That is an important theme, of course, is that one part of the answer to your question, I guess, is the age-old answer that, once the elite gets interested in something, then you're going to see it showing up in the mainstream. You're going to see it commodified, too.
Yeah, and, there's a lot of good work, like Mindful America, Jeff Wilson's book was very, very informative. So anyway, as we're moving into this sort of like repurposing and something they call it recontextualization, and I think, at least some of the critiques we've been trying to make have been misinterpreted too. That we're not arguing that we need to go back to some sort of idealized, authentic purity, the authentic Buddhism. That's totally nonsense.
Yeah, that's one of the ways they get you, right?
Yeah. It's a false, it's a strong person. Yeah.
And that's, to me, just some sort of rhetorical deflection, when they do that. But this whole like trajectory of putting mindfulness to work, this whole idea of this instrumentalized.
That's a great double entendre, isn't it?
Yeah.
It really captures it.
Yeah, and you make the point in the chapter that and this comes up throughout the book, is is how they take one of the most radical, as you said, a term for the real, maybe an anatman, no self.
Yeah.
And they flip it. They flip it into this essentialized discourse.
Right.
So now, we got to search inside ourselves for our authentic self, and
And so part of the answer to it is an interesting question. How do these things happen? And I try to help along an answer with the idea that, well, we become subjects. We're involved in a certain kind of ideology. There's certain kind of mechanisms of subject formation, and we need to examine that a little bit. Then we'll understand how what you just described happens. So part of what our current ideological formation, you mentioned some of the main themes like resilience, vulnerability, the old kind of neoliberal idea that the world's not going to change. So you're going to have to just figure out how to fix your mind so that you can function within it well.
Yeah, it's always the subject that's malleable, isn't it?
Always a subject, and it's always so an idea like anatman gets flipped around to fit very nicely the ideology of the tyranny of positivity and the need to find happiness, and it cannot remain. I forget the language that Loy uses that in the quote when I treat him in the book, but he talks about the anatman as being I can't remember the language, but it's definitely like a very pejorative way of speaking about it. And that I found very curious until I started thinking about the work of someone like Barbara Ehrenreich, and her bright side.
Oh, yeah, she's great.
And I was like, well, how can Loy not be part of this larger culture, this larger insistence that we find value and meaning and something assertive and positive, or affirmative and positive. So we're subjects of that larger formation, and understanding that larger formation helps us to understand why the smaller figures do what they do with Buddhist material. And that's what part of what this chapter was about, was trying to get at what the neoliberal subject is, because that helped to explain some of those parapraxes that you're talking about there.
Yeah. And then in chapter 2, which you call, is that the rhetorical unconscious? Is that the title? I can't remember now. Maybe not. But anyway, let me see.
Chapter 2.
No, the specters of the real. The specters of the real.
Oh, right.
And the rhetorical unconscious. So,
yes.
And so is your project, at least my impression is, you're trying to, relative to chapter 1, you're tell me if I'm wrong, but you're trying to resuscitate it. You're trying to resuscitate Buddhism from its neoliberal coma.
That's not a bad way to put it. Again, I want to be careful, not like you said, like when you guys are doing mindfulness critique, that I'm not trying to
reinsert another
reinsert or fix what's wrong, what people are doing wrong with it. But I do want to. I think the whole thing began with this idea that Buddhism can be a very serious participant in the conversations about how to live as a human being and how to have healthy social formations. There are materials in Buddhism for helping with that, but it has this other thing going on that disables that from happening. So as far as I want to get to that kind of, I don't want to do some sort of what's the word? I'm not trying to correct the errors.
Yeah, it's not a corrective. It's not a corrective. That's not the.
In terms of something original, that's not the point.
Definitely not. But I would like to at least allow some of these other materials to come to the fore a bit and to show how they get hindered through certain practices of Buddhist teachers and Buddhist figures. That's as far as I would go. I don't want to get into it. It's not like a reformism or anything like that.
Right. Yeah. And you, in the book, you take these very formidable forces of thought, as you put it, in Buddhism. You take many of them, like Anatman, and you take suffering, desire, and then you basically show how this turning or this misturning happens. And one of the key concepts in the book, and maybe this is a glue here that connects the critique, is this principle of sufficient Buddhism. Is that in a nutshell like a self-sealing echo chamber?
Yes, I wonder if that metaphor might fit decision better, because it has to do with this kind of auto-giving, auto-reflection, like self-giving, self-reflection of itself. But sufficiency and decision, I think, are the two most damning claims in this critique. And that, so sufficiency is do we want to talk about sufficiency? Are we there yet?
I don't know. Sure.
What you just described, that's a nice metaphor, this kind of self-hearing echo chamber. That's a big theme in this. And that's maybe other terms like specularity, another big term, I use because I think it's useful. It talks about that. It has to do with that. Wherever Buddhist gazes or the Buddhist subject gazes, the good Buddhist subject, he or she always sees Buddhism reflected back, right? Mm-hmm. So that echo chamber metaphor works there.
One thing strikes me is it's almost like Hegel versus Marx in a way. I mean, Hegel, it's like there's a self-contained system, which is, it's not the way to go. I mean, it just reflects back on itself.
Right, and
it's all sealed.
Yes, and that I actually bring that up somewhere in here. It's very much the kind of move that Marx wanted to perform on the left Hegelians of his time, who saw consciousness as being primary and the mover of all things.
Right.
You wanted to say no. Rather, consciousness is formed by the kind of material structures that we create for ourselves. That's very much something operating in this book, very much.
Because that allows for more open-endedness. It's not
that's an actual claim, is that if we could operate in that way, we're in this kind of state of this perpetual state of producing novelty. That it is, the material is perpetually open-ended, and that's why it ends with this idea of Buddha fiction, with me actually performing this really, what a lot of people are telling me is a quite bizarre text at the end. That's my idea of Buddha fiction, is precisely, so in your example, the Hegelian approach would be to keep this within, as a authoritarian unitary system of thought that can only be articulated correctly and fully by those who have attained mastery of it. And those who have attained mastery have been granted mastery because they've become good subjects of the system. And so it's kind of what Althusser talks about, the self-replication of an ideological system.
And that's a lineage issue too.
Yes, absolutely. The lineage performs that function. So one way of looking at a lineage is just like, these are just reproduced good subjects. So Laurel would want to perform what Marx is performing in your example, which is flipping this all on its head and saying that can only be preserved at a cost. That structure can only be preserved, and the cost is damning in the case of Buddhism, probably in the case of Hegelianism too, because Buddhism claims to be something like a science of the real. And Hegel would also use certain kind of language about it, a science of, the history of Geist or whatever. But when they make that move, they're foreclosing that possibility that it can be such a thing. It actually just becomes a visionary form of thought, or in Laura Wellman language, he talks about an hallucinatory form of thought, rather than a kind of science that investigates material structures and so forth. I'm not sure I made any sense right here.
Yes.
Yeah, I keep coming back to this conceptual parapraxis, as you put it.
Yes.
This misturning, and in Buddhism it has a term, right? Is it paravriti?
Yeah, that's the term. That's what was interesting, because Loy himself used that term in the book I was looking at, right? Paravriti.
Yeah.
What page are you on? Because
well, it's around page 69, but I think Lloyd comes earlier than that. But
so he's writing about, he's like, we have this thing like no self, and it's just like this like pit of darkness, and we can't let that abide. So luckily, there's this idea in Buddhism of a turning. So we can turn from that abyss of no self into this element of no self being this kind of fullness, and this creation of meaning and value. And I thought it was really interesting because I don't even know if he understood the irony of what he was saying. The parvriti that he uses actually means that something becomes something other than what it was intended to be.
Right.
That it's a refusal to continue along the path it was going on, and this kind of thing. In other words, he's using the term to actually say precisely what is happening. That this concept of no self is being turned around to become something precisely other than what it was on the way to being.
Right. So you make that point in the book. Like your whole critique is this of Western Buddhism is it's not, as you put it, faithful to.
Yes.
Fully faithful to the Buddhist real, if you want to put it that way.
And even to its own thought.
Yeah.
And I would say, I just want to remind everyone, and it's not necessarily the Buddhist, there's not like a script written in the Buddhist material, it's people. It's human figures doing this kind of work with the Buddhist material. Mm-hmm. And I would just say, so what would it mean to actually let no self do its work? I mean, Loy is writing this in a book that has a subtitle about something about revolution, the possibility of Buddhist materials, in kind of human revolution, and money, sex, war, karma. What is the subtitle of that book?
Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah,
I have it right here on my shelf.
Oh.
David Loy's a good friend of mine, and I was actually quite deep into his book on lack.
Yes.
And psychotherapy, death, and some title like that. And
I'm sorry, go ahead, Dave.
Money, sex, war, karma, notes for a Buddhist revolution.
Yeah, and so that's why I chose that book, because I thought I wanted, and also another engaged Buddhist I treat in here. What is his name? I forget. It's slipping my mind right now.
Ken Jones?
Yes. Because I wanted to take people who are actually trying to think about social ramifications of Buddhist thought and so forth. And I wanted to see how they treated this material. So the no self idea is very interesting because it points to something like the idea of a subject, a person that we don't have any sort of essential set qualities, so that we're formed by the structures around us, language, education, mores of a culture, and so forth. And that can't somehow abide in certain kind of Buddhist thought. And that's significant, that it has to be somehow made into another kind of subject that does have certain qualities and abilities and values and so forth. So I thought if people working in engaged Buddhism perform this turning, then it's a pretty serious symptom of a Buddhist thought.
Yeah, and you make the argument, I think, in the book that this misturning, parapraxis, is at the heart of the very identity of Western Buddhism, right?
I believe that, and and that means I think I could go back and look at a book like Lack, and I could. So what I think I've created here are tools for a critique that anyone who wants to go look at a book or a text or listen to a Dharma talk could see whether that's true or not. That at some point during this presentation, this material is going to inch towards human reals, death, no self, dependent origination, whatever, but is then going to somehow perform a turn away from that. That's what I would predict, but based on the theory I created here.
Right. And so L'Oreal, you're drawing so much from, which is fascinating. This whole idea of using thought as a force.
Yes.
And so in a way it's, so much of the mindfulness and the whole Western Buddhist is very much kind of subsumed by anti-intellectual sentiments, the valorization, of so-called direct experience and pure awareness and all this kind of stuff. And I'm wondering, at some level, I've been thinking about this, that is Western, maybe it should be called Buddhism, not Western Buddhism, and Buddhist Americanism.
That's good.
Yeah, and not just that. Yeah, turn it back.
Yeah, that's good. That's good because that gets the balance right.
Yeah, but I was also thinking that is it really Buddhist or is it just an upgrade? Is it 2.0, like Wisdom 2.0? It's like American Transcendentalism 2.0.
Yes, I like that.
Yeah.
And even that could be Transcendental Americanism, right?
Yeah.
You got to get the balance right. Like, which one is the modifier and which is the main noun here,
Yeah, so I mean, that comes through really strong, and, I think it's a point of really inquiry as why does it back away from the real? Why is it always attenuating it? Like it senses that, look, as you were saying, Buddhism has offered tremendous, rich, liberating thought. But why does it back away?
There's fear there.
There's what?
Fear.
I mean, so you could have a kind of psychoanalytic oriented answer going towards things like fear and the need for comfort and all that. You could also go towards an answer that says, and I like both of these answers, that says it's because we are certain kinds of subjects and a certain kind of social formation, and this is what we do. Mm-hmm. We take anything and turn it into some sort of celebratory, self-consoling, affirmative way of thinking or being. I mean, that's what we do as Americans, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. We don't like pessimism.
No.
It's a bad word, or nihilism, even though these can be very rich forms of thinking. Like a politics, a pessimistic way of thinking about politics might be healthier and truer than our kind of perpetual optimistic ways of thinking about it.
That's one of those stereotypes between Americans and Europeans.
Yes.
Americans are always pessimistic and smiling, and Europeans are existential and not smiling.
Honesty. I think I've been talking about the autobiographical importance of what we ended up doing, and that time in Germany taught me the value of what you just said, David. Was these Germans they tended to not be on the surface so friendly or accepting, or they'd often argue just for the sake of fleshing out an idea. And I really valued that. It helped me to see the American way in contrast.
I've always enjoyed. I don't go to conferences in the U.S. hardly. If I'm going to go to a conference, it's going to be in Europe. And,
There's some good arguments.
But I'd like to step back and let me try this on for size and tell me if I'm, I came out of the social sciences and you've heard of Kurt Lewin?
I'm afraid I haven't.
Okay, well, he had a really good saying, and I think you're going to like it. He said, "There's nothing so practical as a good theory."
I like it.
Yeah.
Yes.
And
I love it.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you.
So as I look at, taking a step back from everything in the book and trying to make sense of it in a way that understand your project it seems like what you're trying to do is revitalize this force of thought.
Yes.
And like you said, follow it wherever it goes. I mean, so you're kind of like have a generative approach, right, to critical creative inquiry, if you want to call it that. In other words, allowing the inquiry to develop its own dynamic.
Absolutely.
And then even what's presented through the inquiry still has to be continually challenged.
Absolutely.
And so that keeps that at least disables, as you say, the sufficiency principle.
Right, and it also disables the kind of fetishism of thought representation.
Yeah, like the present moment, right?
Yes, and this leads to, maybe we'll talk about the stranger subject at some point, but this is a way of being force of thought in Lorwell is this idea that this stuff has actually lived in our thinking. And we think constantly. We're constantly making judgments and evaluations and analyzing data, even at subtle levels. So force of thought is a way of speaking about how these ideas aren't abstractions that are operating on us, but they're incorporated into our very thinking moment by moment.
So I guess I was saying that this misturning dynamic, does it have anything to do with like our human propensity to try to possess something and make it our own or something like that? That's a hard one.
I think part of the answer of why we do that is something psychoanalysis tries to get at. And the other part has to do with history and subjectivity and that sort of thing. So I don't really know how to answer that question. Is it some way? It turns out that the kinds of subjects who are brought up in, say, a Buddhist institution continually perform this misturning. But what their motives are, I don't really know. But institutionally, what it serves is just what you're describing, to perpetuate a kind of ownership.
So reproducing of it's like reproducing conceptual structures.
Yes.
And then it kind of reforms into positions and territories, right? That then kind of like muffle or squelch. It calls inquiry to a halt.
Yeah, and you could say that on your ownership idea that one reason we have different forms of Buddhism, different communities and so forth, is because they make different decisions about how this thing is going to misturn, like what we're going to misturn it into.
Yeah, it seems like, is that what decision is about? Because it seems like there's this reliance on labels and these terms, but then they're just reflecting back what we already understand and what we're comfortable with. Like we're staying within the comfortable zone, which of the already familiar. So we say, oh, emptiness, oh, that means fullness.
Right.
Oh, suffering, oh, that means stress.
Right. Yes.
And the institutionalized part of it is like, well, we need to join a team, right? The Western Buddhist identity team. And so it's like we're taking the presupposed as our starting point, but it returns us in the end right back to it.
Well, that's the very definition of circular thinking, right?
Yeah.
I'm thinking sociologically again that there's a kind of a conservative dialectic with revolution, and then people form the system and they become conservative and they want to maintain what they can as a democracy.
Yeah.
So it's self-preservation.
Right. Yes. So once this stuff gets institutionalized the way it does, what you're describing becomes a very powerful motivating force, right?
Yeah.
To perpetuate this community of belief, and this is how we do it. I remember that was always the answer in the Zen communities I was in. It's like, why do we do this? It's just our way, It's
and I share your kind of anti-authoritarianism, and that would grate on me. I think that's one reason I never had the discipline or patience to be in one of those kind of communities, because I would chafe at that kind of response.
Yes. And you would never make a good subject or something.
I would not.
And see, and I would also say, and I argued this in the Cruel Theory book, is I brought in Althusser's student, Peychaud, I think was his name, and he talks about the good subject, who just toes the line, the bad subject who's still very much formed by the system or the institution, but in a confrontational way.
Right, but it's still attached to it.
Yes.
It still has to rebel against it because they've internalized that very thing that they're trying to rebel against.
So he would say, Peychaud would say, for that reason, because that's still just a form of entrapment, he would say the goal is to become a disidentified subject.
Yes, exactly, which is what you would think is what mindfulness is about and Buddhism is about, and in many cases it's not.
You would think that that those forms of thought would would encourage people to become this kind of disidentified subject. You absolutely, totally would. I agree. Because it seems to be that's the logical conclusion of their material is don't, what the Buddha says, don't carry the boat,
the raft,
the raft when you get to the other side. Or in the Dhammapada, there's this great image of like when the house like comes tumbling down, the rafters start coming. You don't rebuild it.
Yeah.
Let it lie in ruins. I love that image.
Yeah.
So it says right in Buddhism, it says, when you see the Buddha on the road, kill him.
Yeah.
And so forth. It says the same thing, and yet it cannot, for whatever reasons, abide that. And it has to perform this conceptual parapraxis where it fixes the potential dangers and damage of persisting in that kind of thinking towards the real. The collapsed house or the body, bereft of refuge and raft and so forth.
I'm wondering, is there a parallel, Glenn, between the same thing that's happened with Christianity in terms of, if you look at the mystical teachings of Christ or the apostles, I mean, there were radical desert father people, and then you just see this whole misturning going on through.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And
I would say that this theory actually just shows the protean nature of Laruelle's thinking, which can be applied. And Laruelle writes a lot on mysticism because mysticism, like Zen or Buddhism generally, is very interesting because it seems to be articulating this liberating, this nature of the real and the importance of not flinching from it. And yet they perform these flinches. So that's what makes them particularly interesting forms of human thought. And that's another important idea, is that this Laruellian kind of thinking allows you to see these as just human productions trying to understand what it is to be a human being, how to live in the world, and not the kind of authoritarian, fixed, unitary forms that they present themselves in. And that allows for a kind of freedom of productivity.
And some of the language, Laruelle, he talks about the rejection of the world.
Yes.
And the world, is that symbolizing the given? You could say the given.
The world with the capital W is this kind of harassing structure we find ourselves in, that's telling us what to be, how to do. We have capitalism that defines so much of what our lives is about. If it weren't for money, what would we be doing with ourselves? Or if it weren't for the need to work? It's kind of harassing nature of the material structures around us. He calls that the world with a capital W.
Mm-hmm. And if you go to the Buddha, then if you want to, it was basically a total refusal of the world.
Right.
A conventional society.
Yeah, and you make the point in the book, and I thought it was really cool. You said, well, maybe the Buddha was doing non-Vedic.
Right.
I mean, really. I mean, I think there's something to that.
I mean, the Buddha as a human figure is so hopelessly lost, I think, in these texts that I can never speak now with a literary. How do I put it? Like, the Buddha is a historical figure who's been completely supplanted by a literary figure or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Who knows who this person was anymore, what he thought, or who knows? There's so little information in the texts.
Could we talk about what does he mean by the organon?
Well, the organon is a really important concept here because, like Buddhism, for example, it claims to be an organon. Like in philosophy, they use this term organon. It's an instrument of knowing.
An instrument of knowing. Okay.
Yeah. So, for example, philosophy, like there's one young philosopher, Ray Brassiere, wrote a really cool book called Nihil Unbound. And in that book, he's making the argument that philosophy perpetually flinches from its own insights into the nature of nihilism, for example. So he says, philosophy is an organon of nihilism. It's a structure of thought that allows us to use our reasoning powers, our thinking abilities to come to the conclusion that there are no final, unassailable, universal truths, including that one. And he's like, it's philosophy, the discipline of philosophy, that kind of thinking that allows us to come to that. That's an organon. An organon is an instrument in science that allows us to see phenomena, bacteria, or the galaxies in formation. An organon is an instrument. It's just a fancy word for an instrument. It's and Buddhism claims to be an organon in that it's a claims to be a form of thought that allows us to see into the true nature of reality. And the argument here, Laura Well uses this argument for philosophy, and I use it for Buddhism, is that the problem is that Buddhism starts mixing its own postulates into the organon. So and this is where this idea, you say there's a lot of interrelated ideas, and you're absolutely right. This is where this idea of science thought comes in.
Right.
So science thought is a way of thinking that refuses to mix in these sort of obvious, overtly ideological, elements of thought into the organon. It's on guard against that. Like good science is really careful not to do that. We can argue, like certain thinkers do, like Feyerabend. Science still does that, but that just shows how difficult it is.
And that's kind of what you bring up with the idea of the stranger, right?
Yes.
The stranger is someone who's not going to be subjugated, and it's trying to. I don't know if I don't like the word bracketing, but it's saying no. I'm not going to take that for granted.
Yeah, that's right.
And there's this wrestling and grappling and fighting and critical, creative engagement with the material.
Yeah, the stranger is in kind of perpetual struggle against the harassing nature of the world.
Right, yeah.
Including some of the most harassing agents of the world are forms of thought like Buddhism and mindfulness. These kind of seemingly innocuous, natural remedies for sadness and stress that end up alienating us from ourselves, arguably. And the stranger is someone who is on perpetual alert to these forces of alienation and harassment.
And you make a really strong, forceful point in chapter 5. You say basically something like
what page are you on there?
143, actually. 143. That we're mistaking a representation of the real for the real itself.
Yes.
And that ex-Buddhism continues to harass us. And so, in a way, I think, put it simple terms, that you're basically saying they don't practice what it preaches. It's talking a good game, but it's not really.
Or how about this? Or it's the text of Buddhism, like the language and ideas and the concepts, is this rich array of potential preaching material. And it takes very specific human agents to do something with that. But it's very hard for them to do something with that counters the social formation in which they're embedded.
A counter subject formation. Yeah.
How do they step outside the socially constructed?
Exactly. Even if there's something about the material that can be used to be a critique of the social formation. That's what I say in the beginning. Western Buddhism strikes me as what I say, like a faith.
It's subsumed in a science and a faith, and
a faith subsumed in an ideology, subsumed in a critique.
Yeah, that's it. But I think you really come back to this rhetorical question, and maybe it's not rhetorical, but it's like you're not, as you said earlier, you're not trying to prescribe a corrective or anything like that, right? But you're basically saying, what are we to make? What are we to make of Western Buddhism? And how to use it?
That's it. That's exactly it. I don't think Western Buddhism has a future as a serious form of thought in America. I think for many years, decades, serious thinkers gave Buddhism serious attention.
Yeah.
But I think that's dwindling, and with the way mindfulness has been using the materials and and Zen forms seem more and more strange and clownish and alien to the younger generation. I talk to a lot of people in their 20s. They're like, where are those Zen clowns in those uniforms? I love Zen, so I'm just saying, this is how they're. I'm wondering if with their bibs, as one person put it to me recently. Like, why is that Zen clown wearing the bib or something? Whatever we think of this and whatever value we might be able to create out of that, however good ways we might have of explaining the usefulness of these forms, I think fewer and fewer people in America are taking them seriously. And I think if Buddhism wants to maintain some sort of foothold in American intellectual culture, something like this has to happen. Like it can no longer resist its own form of thought. It just starts looking like a visionary form of religious thought, and people who work in psychoanalysis or in philosophy or the sciences only have so much patience for that. That's my feeling.
Yeah, and I was thinking that you just made the point that there was some serious thinking going on at one time. And I'm wondering, and then when you're talking about decision, then L'Oreal's term that Western Buddhism maybe is a premature decision in the sense that it's already staked its claim in terms of what its identity is. But I'm wondering, going back to, let's say, the migration of Indian Buddhism to China, for example, talk about serious translations that were going on for hundreds and hundreds of years and grappling, no, we don't want to do everything the Indians were doing, right?
Yeah.
And that's not happening in Western Buddhism.
I know what's happening in Western Buddhism.
It's not happening.
Whatever is happening really, really fast, right?
Yeah, the acceleration of.
Well, that's why Freud said psychoanalysis wouldn't survive in the West, because the Americans, not in the West, he thought America, wouldn't work, but in America, because he thought they need results real fast.
Yeah. I see such a parallel there to this Americanization of mindfulness.
That's the American way. I mean, the insurance companies will give a therapist short-term therapy insurance, but psychoanalysis is costly long-term, and so on. So it's not, doesn't thrive.
So with managed care, kind of, forget it. I mean,
exactly.
And you wonder if there's a kind of managed care mentality that's pervasive, and it's even kind of showing up in Buddhist thought, so that we go from long-term serious meditation rhetoric to mindfulness or something.
Well, in mindfulness, we all know there's apps. I mean, just
right.
Plug in your app.
And it's, if we look at the larger subject formation of a society, we should be able to predict. We should have been able to predict something like that, right?
Yeah, you make some really good points in Chapter 6 on Buddho-fiction.
Yes. Can we just say one real quick thing about decision before doing? I don't want to talk long about decision because it's the most difficult of all the ideas in here, I think. And
okay. Yeah.
It's almost unbearably difficult to read through L'Oreal on decision, but it's also probably even more so than sufficiency the most important idea, and I think it really constitutes the most damning critique of Buddhism. And I just want to be really brief about it, just to get it out there, so to speak. But what decision is it's an operation of it's okay. It's decision is when a system of thought that claims a kind of empiricism or immanence, that it's really talking about what is part of human experience, tactile human experience, that what that system of thought is claiming about immanental existence is cut through with something that grounds its adequacy, and it creates a warrant for itself, so to speak, and a certain transcendental operator. So I'm not sure if these are L'Oreal's words or my own, but I have a note here that says decision is an operation of transcendence that believes in a naive and hallucinatory way in the possibility of a unitary discourse on reality. I wrote that there because I think it sums it up. It's an operation of transcendence that believes that you can have a unitary discourse on reality. And the problem is Buddhism claims it's operating, and this is all the secular Buddhist rhetoric, for example. This is what they're all about is, Buddhism is empirical, it's phenomenologically verifiable, it's like a science in that way, so you can't talk about rebirth or anything like that.
Right.
But I think the argument that even the secularists have this decisional operator where they ground those claims into some sort of transcendental operator like the Dharma.
Oh, the Dharma is a big one. Yep.
The Dharma is the big, I think, excellent, the big Buddhist transcendental operator. So all these things we're saying about the real world, about samsara and about paticca and all this, all that has its ultimate grounding in the Dharma.
It's like a magical master signifier, right?
It is exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, Kant has this beautiful idea. He called it the transcendental illusion. He says the human, I think it's on page 123. I try to read my scribble here. The human penchant for taking, that's my writing here. Wait. The human penchant for taking a subjective necessity. Oh, wait a minute. I can't read my own handwriting. I'm going to just look in the book here. And I won't find it, of course. Let me try. I'll try my handwriting again. The human penchant for taking... So this is something like decision. Kant calls it a transcendental illusion. And it is the human penchant for taking a subjective necessity of a... connection of our concepts for an objective necessity in the determination of things in themselves. So he says, we will call the principles whose application stays wholly and completely within the limits of possible experience immanent, but those that would fly beyond those boundaries transcendent principles. By the latter, I mean principles that actually incite us to tear down all those boundary posts and to lay claim to a wholly new territory that recognizes no demarcations anywhere. I would claim that that's a great description, with a little grain of salt here, of Laurel's concept of decision. It creates this actual scission, like this cut through the immanent and the transcendent operator that gives it its ultimate warmth and verification. And Buddhism does that, which I think is the most damning critique you can make of it, and because that just becomes a visionary form of thought, or in Laura Reller's term, a naive and hallucinatory form of thought, because it's not grounded in immanent practice. It's grounded in this thing that flies beyond immanent practice, right? You can say anything you want about that which is beyond, that flies beyond the boundaries of the immanent. That's why we have millions and millions of concepts, of spiritual entities and so forth. Say anything. There's no limitations on it. There are no restrictions on it. If it flies beyond the immanent, if it's within the immanent, you need arguments and you can use reason and proofs and so forth to give validity to your argument.
So the decision is basically a move as a foreclosure of inquiry, you could say.
Absolutely,
and at the same time, it's making the move by trying to stand above, as you say, transcendent, standing over and above.
Absolutely, and that's where this idea of the specular comes in. Buddhism is always over and above, ultimately, the whole.
And so that way it maintains its sufficiency by doing that.
Exactly.
Yeah, it stays self-contained.
Exactly.
Despite its claim that it isn't.
Right. It's self-contained, and there it becomes, because of the specularity, it becomes self-perpetuating and auto-giving and so forth.
And you make a really cool point on page 118, I have to say this, is that you bring up this irony, or maybe I'm bringing it up, but you say that the more Western Buddhism goes towards, secular Buddhism, atheist and naturalized, it's actually even more implicated in transcendence.
Yeah.
I mean, it's quite an irony that it's making that move. And another thing about the Dharma that, we've been harping on this for a while, the whole idea of the universal Dharma, the essence of the Dharma. And, I've heard some Western Buddhist teachers say, well, the Dharma will take care of itself. We don't have to worry about it, right? It's a common talking point. Yeah. And the mindfulness merchants are basically saying, look, the Dharma is, we got the Dharma, and so there's no, case closed.
Yeah, right. $9.95 a month. I mean, that's why Laurel says Buddhism can be the kind of science of the real that it seems to be, in some ways wants to be, but there's a tremendous ransom to be paid, is the way he puts it, and that is to give up this pretense of the decision, which if you get rid of decision, you also get rid of sufficiency.
Yeah.
So Buddhism can be this kind of science thought rather than this visionary form of thought, but the ransom is steep.
Yeah. There's a really powerful quote that I wanted to read on what you say, as Laurel claims for non-philosophy. 145 at the bottom, page 145. It says, as Laurel claims for non-philosophy, I am claiming for speculative non-Buddhism, that the problem is how to use it, how to make something from it, and for the stranger. Then the quote is, the problem is how to use philosophy so as to effect a real transformation of the subject in such a way as to allow it to break the spell of its bewitchment by the world and enable it to constitute itself through a certain struggle with the latter. I think that's just
that's beautiful.
It is beautiful. I mean, it's so
I think I go on to say this is actually probably the most positive statement I've read in all the Laurel I've read.
It was very positive.
In the sense that it actually points to some sort of practice.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And I think that's what I love about your book, and what you're doing is that you're basically saying, look, practice as theoretical reflection and theoretical reflection as practice.
Right, exactly. What was that? Nothing so practical as theory.
As a good theory, yeah.
Well, no, just that it be people. This is an endless conversation I have with people like, oh, it's theoretical, oh, it's speculative,
right.
Oh, it's
too intellectual.
Like, no, this is a form of practice. This is the idea of a force of thought. We're thinking continually, and thought has a kind of force in the world, and that is the definition of praxis, or practice, living in the world. So this kind of theoretical thinking is a practice.
Yeah, and I mean, if you look at the corpus of the force of thought in Buddhism, I mean, man, there's a tremendous amount of thinking going on. Absolutely. But, we're kind of duped into this, oh, no, we can't think, we have to retreat into this,
And again, it's not the fault of Buddhism, it's
right.
the fault of the people who are using these materials.
Mm-hmm.
Buddhist materials have a lot of things going on. I mean, there are gods talking to the Buddha in the Pali Canon.
Yeah.
And there are places in the Pali Canon where the Buddha seems to be a radically immanent thinker.
Right.
That have nothing to do with gods or anything like that. You can do all kinds of things with this material.
Yeah, but I think one of the key themes that you're bringing up too is just how thinking has become like demonized, right? And
yes.
In Western Buddhism, and this kind of leads to this idea that this John Kabat-Zinn basically parrots all the time, is that we're suffering from a thinking disease, as he puts it.
I know.
We're suffering. He calls it the ADD nation, and that the culprit is that we're thinking, and so we have to rise above it or sink below it, right?
Right. What is the tagline on your?
Yeah, we're thinking is not such a bad thing. I think
not necessarily bad.
That's not necessarily a bad thing.
You have to say that.
Yeah, imagine. Yeah, we're being
well, again,
ironic.
It's this idea that I like the idea that Buddhist Americanism would suggest that that's what would happen in Buddhism, that it would develop this anti-intellectual rhetoric, right?
Mm-hmm. Could predict that.
I don't think German Buddhists talk about. Well, maybe they do. Who knows? Maybe you have that in German Buddhism as well. But it is a serious issue, and I always say, don't think less, think better. And you could even argue that what is the very heart of Buddhism? It's this word Bud, which means intelligence. I mean, that's another usage of the word. Yeah, to waken up. It's for consciousness coming into light rather than into the dullness of sleep.
Sharpening the sword of intelligence, critical intelligence.
That's why I love Manjushri as a.
Me too.
With a sword. Yeah, me too.
Absolutely.
Actually, Ron has a picture of himself about to be chopped.
by Manjushri's sword?
Yeah.
That's good. I like that. So,
we've been going at this a bit. What do you think? It's just so much in your book that I'm just not doing it justice in one session like this.
Yeah.
And to be honest with you, I read it through once, and so much of it was still opaque to me, and much of it still is. But then on a second reading, I don't know what happened, but it started coming through really like. I don't know, that happens. With a book like yours and many other books that I respect, these are books you just kind of have to keep working with.
Yeah, and I think not that many people have read it so far because it's very expensive. There is a less expensive paperbacks coming out next April 2020. Mm-hmm. I probably shouldn't say this, but people can also download a copy for free at Libgen. I don't know if you know that place.
I've heard of it.
Sort of like guerrilla, what do they call themselves? Guerrilla open source hackers or something. They go around, they get like what they think are interesting scientific or other kinds of articles that are too expensive, and they make them available. Yeah. So there are people reading it, and from that and others. And one criticism that I always hear is like that it's too difficult and this and that and the other. But I think it's actually really clearly written personally. And
how long did it take you to write this book? This is quite a piece of work here.
I think it took me 3 years. That sounds like a long time out.
Was some of it from your blogs, or
a lot of the thinking came from the blogs? I didn't like cut and paste anything from the blog.
No, I could tell that. Yeah,
probably a lot of the thinking, a lot of the ideas were worked out on the blog. Might have taken 2 years. I can't remember now. But my point is that it's this funny argument you get in Buddhist circles is that that book is like the language is so unnecessarily difficult, and how's it go again? It's like it's so difficult. So on the one hand, people argue it's too difficult that they can't understand it. On the other hand, they argue that they disagree with it. Part of the point of like the language on the blog, I very, very intentionally said, this is going to be an in-your-face, anti-right speech language blog. That I'm going to counter that kind of anemic Buddhist writing and that kind of like just nice do-goodism.
Yes, self-congratulatory, celebratory.
Everyone's the phony niceness, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Kind of
the mindfulness etiquette.
Yeah, and I don't, and I'm kind of continuing along that line. Part of the hope, and we did that with Cruel Theory, Sublime Practice too. Part of the hope is that, and this is actually happening. I mean, I'm in touch with younger people writing. There's some younger people writing blogs, even like the failedbuddhist.com.
Oh, I haven't heard of that one.
Really interesting stuff. I just got an email today from a young woman in Florida who was doing some stuff on Reddit. She told me she's going to start a blog soon, and it's really intelligent stuff.
Thefailedbuddhist.com, huh?
Critical theory. Well, thefailedbuddhist.com or maybe failedbuddhist.com. I'm not sure which. Mm-hmm. Tom Pepper opened up his blog again. But the point is talk about the force of thought, is that thought can be a force in the material world as well. So part of the hope was that I get like Buddhists, like it's a long story, but I wrote this piece and I used Lacan and his 4 discourses in the piece, and the editor was like, this is too hard. And I'm the thing was written for Buddhist practitioners. I was like, well, if they think they understand like the teachings that point to the like truth of the cosmos, surely they can understand Lacan. I mean, that's my thinking about this stuff is that we have to be able to handle difficult material,
Yeah, it should be worth it. It should be. Yeah.
Yeah. And you've had a number of podcasts with Matthew O'Connell on. I love his podcast, the Imperfect Buddhist podcast.
Yes. Yeah, he's doing good work too.
He's doing great work. He's really quite a sharp. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Force of thought can have real impact in the real world, right?
Yeah.
It has, and it will.
Nothing so practical as theory.
Nothing so practical as a good theory, yeah. Maybe we'll end on that note, Glenn, and keep thinking.
Yes.
All right.
Don't think less, think better.
That's a good one. Okay.
We'll start our own bumper sticker company.
Yeah, cool. All right. See you later. Thanks for being on the Mindful Cranks, Glenn. We'll get you back.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Thank you, David.
We've been speaking with Glenn Wallis, who holds a Ph.D. in Buddhist Studies from Harvard University's Department of Sanskrit and Indian Studies. His training was mainly philological, concentrating on Sanskrit, Pali, Tibetan Buddhist literature. Glenn has been concerned with how to make classical Buddhist literature, philosophy, and practice relevant to contemporary life. Since the early 1990s, Glenn has taught in the religion departments of several universities, including the University of Georgia, Brown University, Bowdoin College, and the Rhode Island School of Design, and most recently at the Won Institute of Buddhist Studies. Glenn has also practiced for many years in several Buddhist traditions, including Vipassana, Dzogchen, and mainly Soto Zen. And at various periods in his life, he has led meditation groups and offered retreats. His recent work, A Critique of Western Buddhism, Ruins of the Buddhist Real, was published by Bloomsbury in London and draws from Francois L'Oreal's Non-Philosophy. Other works include his book Cruel Theory, the basic teachings of the Buddha, the Dhammapada, Verses on the Way, Mediating the Power of Buddhas, and most recently, Buddhavacana, a Pali reader. Glenn's blog, Speculative Non-Buddhism, contains many essays by him and others that reflect the critical direction of his work. Glenn is also the founder and director of Incite Seminars. As he describes it, he founded Incite Seminars as a very personal response to the escalating social inequality, intensifying racial unrest, and the eviscerating techno-consumer capitalism that he increasingly witnessed all around him. Incite Seminars was thus founded on the conviction that education in the humanities offers us a means to recognize, resist, and counter the forces of personal alienation and social division, forces such as hopelessness, bigotry, passivity, and self-delusion. For this reason, from the outset, Glenn conceived of Incite Seminars as a community of learners engaged in a vital practice. Each seminar would be an experiential immersion in the self-reflection, self-formation, and social critique. Through reading, thinking, and discussion, participants will realize unknown intellectual potentials, enhance interpersonal communication, and discover creative and effective ways of acting in the world. You can learn more about Glenn's Incite Seminars by checking out the links on episode 13's show notes. Glenn also played rhythm guitar for the psychedelic punk band Ruin, based in Philadelphia. Ruin was first active from 1980 to 1986 and has played several reunion shows. We end this episode with a cut called Rule Worshipper from Ruin's recent album, He Ho Fiat Lux. Thank you for listening to The Mindful Cranks. Be sure to check out our website, mindfulcranks.com, where you could find many of our writings. Please visit our Facebook and Twitter pages, and we would appreciate it if you could write a brief review of our podcast on iTunes. We'll see you next time.